Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video, we're dealing with a viewer request. So a viewer put a comment here saying, could you please have a look at this essay question? The question is, analyze the effects of a sustained increase in a current account deficit on the Australian economy. Now, I think that this is a really relevant and important question and something that you should be able to answer, God, as difficult as it is. What I've done is I thought it could be a good opportunity to look at the balance of payments more generally, so not just focus on the current account. What I've suggested changing the question to for our purposes is analyze the effects of changes in the balance of payments on the Australian economy. So Thomas, don't worry, your elements will still be dealt with, but also we'll get to have a look at what role changes in the capital and financial account could also play on the Australian economy. So let's get started. So in an exam situation, what I might do is I might grab the highlighter out. I'm like, okay, so our directive term is analyze. What we're looking at the effects of changes in Australia's balance of payments, and we want to see how that affects the Australian economy. So what I might do is also make it clear that what we're looking at is we're saying, okay, how do changes in Australia's balance of payments affect the Australian economy? That's the kind of relationship we're looking for. The other thing I might want to do with an essay question is just be really clear in my mind about what this directive term even means. So if I'm looking at analyze, I'm thinking about what are the relationships. So what I'm really trying to do is look very closely at the relationships between these things and the implications or consequences of them as well. So I'm really thinking about, okay, what are the relationships, implications, consequences of changes in Australia's balance of payments on the Australian economy? What do they mean for the Australian economy? All right, so not an easy question by any means. So what I might do is here, so I've got this idea about the directive term, and what I would do is continue to come back to that as I'm writing the essay to keep making sure, am I talking about the relationships? Am I looking at the implications of all of these things for the Australian economy? And then what I might do as well is I might be thinking about, okay, so in constructing this essay, what are the kinds of things that I need to look at? What is the theory that is really being required here? So what I might think as a kind of a big picture view is I'm thinking about, okay, if I'm looking at the balance of payments, what I really have to discuss is the current account and the capital and financial account. And then when I'm thinking about this, just so I can make it even clearer, that when I'm talking about the current account, that really there are two areas that it's worth spending my time on. One is the balance on goods and services, and the other is net primary income. I wouldn't focus on other areas of the current account here. In terms of the capital and financial account, I might be thinking about, okay, I'm thinking about foreign investment. I'm thinking about money coming in. So I could very much think about, so what I'm really thinking about in terms of the capital and financial account, I'm looking at foreign investment and also foreign debt. So I'm thinking about foreign direct investment, portfolio, foreign debt. All of these examples of capital inflows. So when I'm thinking about changes in the balance of payments, what I'm really thinking about are changes in the current account and changes in the capital and financial account. And those are caused by smaller changes, changes in BOX, changes in NPY, changes in foreign investment, foreign debt. So that is the theory that I'll be drawing on in terms of answering this question. So then if we think about our sort of approach to answer this question, what we might look at is then, okay, so what we might say is that, so what we might start thinking about is, okay, so what would be the change in the balance of payment? And then what would be the effect on the Australian economy? Keeping in mind that we want to analyze this effect. We want to think about the relationships, the consequences, those sorts of things. So if we're looking at the change in balance of payments, maybe one thing we could look at is sort of the change in BOG's net exports. right? That when BOGS changes, net export changes, that will affect the balance of payments. So if we're thinking about this, let's say that we get, so we could think about, okay, so let's say that we get a situation of a BOGS surplus, greater BOGS surplus. This is a stimulus. This is a component of aggregate demand net export, so that will increase aggregate demand. Could also reduce the size of the CAD because BOGS would be in surplus. So those could be those things in terms of effect on the economy. Could say, oh, maybe that leads to an increase in the Australian dollar. And then you could start to talk about some of the consequences that then come from that. So again, so we're saying, okay, 1, what is the change in the balance of payments? Number 2, what are the economic effects? 3, what are the kind of implications or consequences of that kind of effect? So let's think about another one, for example. Let's say that there are changes in NPY, right? So if NPY gets larger, or NPY gets smaller. So if we get an increase in NPY, that's likely to increase the current account deficit, which could worsen external stability. But then you could talk about, well, is that even a problem? And here what we're doing is drawing on the Pitchford thesis and this idea that Australia is a net capital importer. It needs capital inflows from overseas. So all of this is useful for the Australian economy as long as it's going towards productive purposes and is being undertaken by businesses who know what they're doing. Likewise, if we see a reduction in NPY, that's sort of our change in the balance of payments here. We could see a reduction in the CAD. We could also see less need for foreign investment or foreign debt. So that's how that change in that element of the balance of payments could then affect the Australian economy. Okay, so let's look at it more broadly now in terms of the overall current account as part of the balance of payments. So let's say that the change we look at is the CAD worsens. So the current account deficit gets larger. In terms of the effect on the Australian economy, okay, yes, we will worsen external stability, just like here, no problems. But what we could also think about is that when the CAD worsens, is that there are a number of implications that we can think about. So implications, consequences, results, all of these things that could happen because of a larger current account deficit. So in terms of the implications, what we could think about is that there could be a loss of confidence in the Australian economy from foreign investors because they're like, oh, the current account deficit is getting too large, external stability is too hard, that the Australian economy is unlikely to pay back all of that money and meet its obligations. So they're going to stop lending Australian money, so that if we even extend this point a bit further, so that if there's a loss of confidence, maybe foreign investors don't lend Australian money. So maybe Australia's savings investment gap gets worse. Maybe that Australia is unable to do as much investment, and this could result in lower living standards. Also, maybe if investors do lend Australian money, they're going to do it at a much higher interest rate, which would increase repayments and worsen NPY and worsen the CAD potentially further. The other thing is that, well, related to that is that if Australia has a higher current account deficit, there is a greater need for capital inflows to meet some of its obligations because there's not enough money domestically, which could in turn lead to a higher current account deficit. So that idea that a large current account deficit creates an even larger current account deficit. So if we just kind of scroll through this section, that what we're really looking at here is you can see that there's this idea that, okay, we look at the change in the balance of payments, the effect on the Australian economy, and we're looking for opportunities to talk about the implications of this. So we've talked about changes in net exports, we've talked about changes in net primary income, and then we've talked about this worsening of the CAD. Yes, there is a crossover between the two, because in terms of this worsening external stability, you could also say, well, actually, it may not be an issue because of the Pitchford thesis in this kind of situation. If we then kind of, for sort of completeness, because remember it's talking about the balance of payments, so we did identify the need to talk about the current account and the capital and financial account, that if we scroll down a little bit more and we think about, okay, so if we were going to discuss changes in the capital and financial account, so what we could say here is that, let's say that there is the change in the balance payments might be an increase and decrease in the capital and financial account surplus, so that if we follow this idea, if the surplus decreases, that means that there is less capital inflow, so that in turn that could create some of these issues as well, that there's less capital inflow, so that there's the saving investment gap gets larger, and that people could experience lower living standards because there is less investment. So if I just make it a little bit smaller here, so we can see that we've got the directive term here up the top, looking at the idea of finding relationships, implications. We've got this question here. And so the way I've set it up is this idea that we're looking at how do these changes affect the Australian economy. You can see that the way this arrow goes from here to here. So I've got changes in balance of payments, effect on Australian economy, and a need to find some relationships and implications. And I've got a bunch of points here. Changes in BOGs, changes in MPY, changes in CAD, changes in the capital and financial account surplus. Now, something that I am missing, and I'm deliberately not including it so that it's that this essay planning idea would last for a while, is that through all of this discussion, that I'm looking for stats, quotes, what's happened throughout history in terms of this stuff, examples. So for example, when I talk about this idea of history, what has the current account deficit been as a proportion of GDP? How has that changed? What have been the economic implications of that? Okay, so I might stop that there. Here's a pretty detailed idea on addressing this particular essay question. Okay, so that was the look at how we might address this essay question, a challenging essay question, I think, but there's lots of good content and current information that you could include to really sort of supplement and support your answer. If there are any questions or issues, please put them in the comments. So if there are any questions or issues, please put them in the comments. Thomas Tang, thank you very much for contributing this question. If you've got other issues, other questions you'd like me to deal with, well, just put them in the comments too. And as always, thank you very much for watching.